Trade regulations. A major part of a nation's macroeconomic policy is regulating the intake and outflow of goods and products, services, and other manners of currency and other manners of economic exchange within and without its borders. This is what we call trade. And regulations upon trade are as old as the establishment of nation-states itself. And we're going to explore trade regulation both without and within, both international and domestic trade, from within the standpoint of de jure first and then de facto later. So let's take a bit of a deep dive into the world of trade. So I want you to ask, what is the difference between de facto and de jure? I want you to spend the next 5 minutes calculating your response. If you were in class, I would say share it with a peer. Since you're not in class, share it with a random individual in the house, or a random friend on social media, or anybody else you want to talk to about it. Get their thoughts, collaborate. Worst case scenario, maybe you'll educate a colleague. All right. I'm not going to let the video sit here for 5 minutes while you all deliberate. At this point, I would ask you to kindly pause the video, perform the exercise, and when you're done, let's come back and let's see how well you did. All right, so de facto versus de jure. De facto, meaning literally of fact in Latin, refers to the manner in which things actually occur irrespective of laws or rules, versus de jure, meaning of law in Latin, which refers to the manner in which things occur in theory or according to the established rules and laws. So this is the difference, right? So, for example, if I were to ask you the question, how fast do people go on the New York State Thruway? Now, the answer de jure, the legal answer, would be no faster than 65 miles per hour, and if slower than 40 miles per hour with their flashing hazard lights on. That would be the de jure answer, based upon the laws that exist for governing that stretch of roadway. A motorist on that roadway should be going no faster than 65 miles an hour, and if they intend to go 40 miles per hour or slower, they need to have flashing hazard lights on to let other automobiles know. Now de facto might yield some different results, right? As anybody who's been going the legal limit and gotten blown past by another automobile will readily testify. Those roads go much faster. So because of this, what we're often stuck with is the simple truth that this is the example of de facto and de jure, right? So that's a good example, right? Now, if we apply this, another interesting way of understanding the concept is I'd like you guys to think about two ideas, social hierarchy and segregation. Because I did the first one for you with speed limit. Now, let's take a look at segregation, right? So if I were to ask you about what is the example of de jure segregation, what might you tell me? If I were to ask you for de facto segregation, same goes for social hierarchy. All right, so take a couple of moments to yourself and meditate on that. Try to find what you think the answer. What might you describe as de jure segregation or segregation of law versus de facto segregation or segregation of fact? So, an example of de jure segregation would be Jim Crow laws, right? The laws in the southern United States in the late 19th through the middle of the 20th century, which mandated that African-American students and Caucasian individuals be separated from each other in public spaces, right? That's an example of de jure segregation. It's in the law, right? It's part of the law. Black people and white people could not eat in the same restaurants, could not use the same drinking fountains, could not attend the same schools, etc., etc. An example of de facto segregation would be urban school segregation. So, for example, if you look at schools in the 5 boroughs, most of the schools, they say, are more segregated today than they were in the time of Jim Crow, right? That you go to schools where the composition will often be either, 90% African American or 90% Caucasian, even though that doesn't reflect the actual composition of the city. And so this is an example of de facto segregation. There's no law that says these schools are exclusively for students of color and these schools are exclusively for white students or exclusively for white and Asian students. Yet, when we actually look at the Now, when we look at this whole business here, these communities are segregated basically by the fact of where people live, how much people make, the grades students have already that prevent them from getting into certain schools due to other economic disadvantages. So there's no law that says it's this way, but the fact remains these schools are segregated. Another example is social hierarchies, right? If you were looking at an example of de jure social hierarchy, look at feudal Europe, right? There are set social classes, and there are laws about them, right? If you are a member of the nobility, it's because you're born into the nobility. Even if you have a lot of money, if you're not from one of those noble families, you can't just go around claiming you're a baron or a count or a duke. There were laws against that. If you wanted to be part of the first estate, if you wanted to be part of the clergy, you had to go through specific, taking holy orders and other rituals. You couldn't just go out and start preaching and say, oh, I'm part of the clergy, right? These classes were separated by law, and there were specific rules about how you became part of certain classes, or how you could be removed from certain classes, By contrast to America, officially in America, there is no class system, right? Officially, you can rise or fall as high or low as your ambition and talent will bring you. But unofficially, there's a very clear set of class systems based on things like education, things like, occupation, family money, established wealth, these types of things that, in effect, make a social hierarchy system, right? We find that the children of millionaires tend to die as millionaires, and the children of working class people tend to die as working class people. Even though there's no official legal system that says, oh, your parents both made less than $100,000 a year, so you are forbidden to ever earn more than $100,000 a year. We do see that more often than not, that is the case. So, if we're looking at trade in America, in this lecture, we're going to be looking at more from the standpoint of de jure, the legal rules that govern trade in the United States. So, free trade. One of the big things that American economy, even though it's mixed, it leans towards the free trade, the capitalist side. So government role in economics and trade is comparatively minimal in the United States, especially when compared to other first world countries like England, France, Italy, etc. And the majority of economic decisions in the United States are made by private citizens or firms. So most of the economic decisions in the United States are being made by private companies or by personal people, right? We don't have a central planning office the way that People's Republic of China does. We don't do that. We don't even have a a very strong economic plan the way that Germany or England would. Most of America's decisions are being made person to person. Nonetheless, there are certain conditions under which the majority of the American public has consented to government intervention. So, for example, health and safety regulations, both for laborers, consumers, and the general public, right? So, labor regulations, right? Rules that state that, machines have to have a certain amount of covering on them, or warning lights, or fail-safes. For example, a lot of machines that are heaters or grinders have to have special fail-safes to make sure that someone can't accidentally turn them on while someone's working inside the machine to clean it, or something like that. Protections for consumers. A large amount of the FDA's job is involved in creating standards for food and medicine to protect the average consumer from getting sick or injured from the use of a product, or even the general public, right? Rules against pollution. That while it doesn't necessarily affect the worker in the factory or the consumer, like say an electric power plant, right, that burns coal, right? Those coal fumes might not directly impact the workers underneath the high smokestacks necessarily, because the smoke rises. And it may not affect the consumer who gets the electric power, but it will affect the general public who lives or works in the immediate vicinity around the factory. We also allow for environmental regulations, right? Laws that say things like you can't just dump toxic waste in a river. You can't overfish in the ocean to the point where you've gotten rid of entire species. You can't just cut down all of the forests and make them into toilet paper. You just can't do it. Intellectual property, right? Copyrights and patents, right? We do expect that if you create something new, whether as an inventor or an artist, that you will be entitled to reap the rewards of that. And that if someone else tries to copy that which is your own unique invention, that the government will step in to protect your unique claim to that invention. So these are circumstances where even many of the most conservative Americans would still say, yeah, for these kind of things, we do need the government to step in and take a role in the economy for these specific sort of things. Now, does the government have a duty to intervene to ensure income inequality, or to ensure equal pay for equal work, or stuff like that? That's something where you're going to get a lot more political infighting. I have my opinion, you have yours, and everyone down in Texas probably has a whole different opinion. But that's life. So that's an example of, government regulations. So what are the types of trade? When we talk about trade. Well, there's foreign trade. This refers to international trade, right? The exchange of goods from outside the country, right? So for example, we don't do as much foreign trade as we used to. But for example, someone orders a new Ferrari, right? That's foreign trade, right? Those cars coming into the United States from Italy. That's an example of foreign trade. Domestic trade is trade within the country, and there are two different versions: intrastate trade and interstate trade. Intra, I-N-T-R-A, state trade, refers to trade occurring entirely within a single state, right? So in other words, Seatown Grocery orders, apples from Twin Star Orchards up in New Paltz, New York. That's intrastate trade, right? Those apples never left the state of New York. They simply moved from one part of New York down to a different part of New York. Interstate trade means trade between two or more states, right? So in other words, if, if ordering avocados from California, right? That would be an example of interstate trade.